Welcome to Your Next Tech Startup. I'm host Isabel Rasmussen. Today I have on a special guest, Daniel, and of course I'm already going to mess it up. So why don't you say it for me?
Schotland, Daniel.
Daniel Schotland from Linqia. And you are COO, but as COO, you actually have all of engineering, CTO down reporting into you. And then what are some of the other departments that you have reporting into you?
Yeah, so product obviously is part of that, and then kind of our go-to-market teams across the organization.
You have an interesting perspective on how things work in engineering in regards to hiring and comparing that to other organizations. Me being a tech recruiter, like I am very used to kind of everything in this bubble of engineering. In our last call, one of the most interesting things that you had pointed out that after you said it, I was like, oh, duh, is that typically like a software engineer as they grow in their career and become an engineering manager, they have only conducted technical interviews. And then as an engineering manager, they typically switch to more of like a behavior interview. How would you say, like on non engineering teams, that's different?
Yeah, I think looking for functional expertise, no matter where you are in the organization, is always important. It just feels like there's a greater expectation of being able to understand more of the softer skills outside of engineering. So if you're hiring as a customer success manager or you're in marketing, those softer skills, cultural alignment, ability to communicate well, how do you get along with everybody, and how do you go up at work every day and deal with challenges and issues and conflict. Those are things that more naturally come up and are part and parcel of the interview process, no matter what level you are in the organization. Because the functional expertise and being able to drill down on their technical aptitude for whether it's back end or front end, or you need someone who really understands, the React framework
Mhm.
for a front end developer, that takes precedence over those other things
Mhm.
as kind of a line engineer, since the engineering manager or the director or CTO who tends to be more responsible for those things. But that also means that engineers, as they grow internally in an organization, when they get to the manager role, they haven't necessarily participated in that same way and aren't necessarily as wired to think about those other set of skills and capabilities that are equally important for an engineering individual resource to have. They just haven't has been part of the fabric of conversation.
Right. And it's not to say in technical interviews, like they're it's a part of it, but it's more of like a check. It's not a core part of it in understanding it, which I do think that does need to shift because I have another episode that's on like conducting technical interviews with empathy. And I was really surprised to hear how much there's like an emptiness that happens in technical interviews, that it's like at the beginning there's this back and forth dialogue, and then it's just kind of like the interviewer just like stares at them for 30 minutes while like they try to figure it out, which is a very uncomfortable process. So there, I think we could solve the problem a bit by just training interviewers, like engineering interviewers, when they're ICs, to think more about these things earlier. But it is hard because on the list of things that happen, like the React is a much higher priority. And then the other piece of it is training. Like, and training is such a, it should be a high priority, but it's such like a on the bottom of the list. Like I'll conduct trainings like when I was in-house recruiting when things were slow, and then you can't conduct, like when things are slow, then maybe there was a layoff, and then you can't do trainings on interviews because then it's like this awkward, like we shouldn't really be talking about interviewing right now. So it's hard to find the right time to do the training. You had noted, how you've seen some hiring steps being done without process, and wanted to hear a bit on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think training is really important, and as you said, not always easy to do. So having a distinct process is important. Like for all roles, certainly engineering too, it's outlining who's the profile of individual that we want for the role, and what are the really important attributes. What are the must-haves? What are the nice-to-haves? I think this is also where some of the differences exist for a marketing role or customer success role. their relatability and those people skills, and not to overly
Yeah.
generalize because engineers have great people skills too. In terms of level of importance that plays in an interview process, it tends to be a nice to have,
Yeah.
or at least in certain cases thought of as a nice to have on the engineering side, where on the other side, it's a must have. And so part of it is like we need to define what we want our engineering culture to be. If that's really important to us, because we expect at Linqia our engineers to interface closely with our product team,
Mhm.
to interface closely with our customer success and client teams, then that needs to be more a part of the conversation,
Yeah.
part of the attributes that are really important to us in thinking about the profile of the individual.
Right. So must have, because the reality is like, even
Exactly.
like if you're needing to have conversations with non-technical stakeholders and that's a core piece of your ability to be successful, I think also the other piece of it that often comes with understanding those conversations with non-technical stakeholders is the ability to understand how your work like impacts the business and care and desire to understand that, which I see we're shifting more and more to that in interviewing, but like I've been interviewing engineers for a decade. And I, I would say I used to just expect principal engineers to be able to do that. And now I think we are definitely shifting to this expectation that in startup world that almost all engineers should be able to do that. But like you're saying, if it's not clearly laid out in the process, then you can easily screw that up in a hire.
Yeah, you can. So that becomes something that the team just isn't necessarily on the lookout for as that must have. It's kind of a nice to have. So I think that's a big part of it. The other one is, and I think this exists at all levels, so it's not just engineering, but maybe there's a little bit more care and feeding that's required of if you're having kind of the line engineers, for example, not engineering management, responsible for parts of the interview process. Of course, there's the technical aptitude,
Mhm.
and we want them to be sussing that out. But what else do we want them to suss out? If it's a must have that they're relatable, they've got good communication skills, the ability to understand the larger picture and not just the one piece of code that they're working on, how do you suss that out? How do you help them understand what's the right way to suss that out? What are the right questions to ask? What are the right ways of having the conversation with the candidate to understand their ability to achieve kind of those other attributes that are important to the role?
So with that, you have felt the training and mentorship that you provide to early career engineering leaders is a bit different because of that. Talk to me a bit about some of the things that you need to dive deep on with early career engineering managers.
Yeah, I think it does tend to be a little bit different. So a lot of it is we have alignment on what are the things that we care about.
Mhm.
How are we going to go about evaluating that as part of the interview process? And so rather than just dictating, it's like, okay, we'll come up with a set of questions that you think will help you understand the technical components
Mhm.
and expertise of this candidate. And then what are the types of questions you're going to ask, or how are you going to conduct the interview to assess these other components?
Mhm.
Oftentimes it's whatever comes back, there's a little bit of work that's required to sit there and help to refine
Mhm.
the questions. Or in a lot of cases, it's less about the questions, but more about how the interview is conducted overall
Yeah.
that will help evaluate.
Yeah.
So I'll give you one quick example. When trying to understand kind of technical aptitude, for example, one of the things that we like to do as an engineer or as an engineering org is, put a problem in front of the candidate. This is the, like, I'm going to give you a set of problems that I'm going to sit here for 30 minutes and you're going to work it out. How do we do that in a different way? How do we think about doing it on a whiteboard and looking at ways in which we can play off each other and see where there is conflict? How do they handle that?
Yeah.
If you're giving them feedback, how do they handle that feedback? How are they able to break down the problem and communicate it in a simple fashion? Would that be something that a product person would understand? Is that something a user would understand? It's not about the questions necessarily, but you conduct the interview in a way that will enable you to understand that.
Yeah. And when I'm talking to people about how to be more effective in interviewing, say, like, tell me about a project that you had a big impact, and then think about who's asking the question. Is this a non-technical person who's asking the question or a technical person? And even if it is a technical person, still not a bad idea to clarify. Do you want me to talk about business impact? Do you want me to talk about the technologies I chose to use? Because oftentimes it's not clarified in the question. And, I encourage candidates to try to get that clarification, but also when you're interviewing, don't let your candidate ramble for 5 minutes about something that you don't want to know. You have to be able to interrupt them and say, I'm not looking for the tech stack you used to solve the problem. I'm looking for how you partnered with stakeholders to solve the problem. And like really having to shift because everybody is so used to just these deep dive tech conversations.
Yeah, no, completely agreed. And I think there's a level of professional maturity required to feel confident and
Yeah.
comfortable in doing that. And folks early in their career who, even as a young engineering manager, may not quite be there yet, but it's really kind of sage advice to get what you need out of the limited time you have during the interview process.
Yeah. And it's also like thinking about, I mean, the number of questions I have come up with to figure out something about a candidate that just fall flat. Like it is a bit of an art, especially like I know I've gotten into things like around culture, like how do you help a new team member feel welcome? And the worst answer I've ever gotten to that is that's not my responsibility. That's the engineering responsibility. Um,
Yeah.
but it's one that people struggle so much with being thrown those type of questions. And so then it's hard to get like good answers.
Yeah, and this is also why I think it's so important to start with a very clear understanding of what are you trying to achieve, what are you trying to accomplish, what are the answers that you need yourself to feel confident in this individual's ability to succeed in the job and in the role. If you don't have that, then it's really hard when asking questions because you're not exactly sure what you're hoping to get from it. Let me ask it a different way because I'm not hearing what I need
Right.
to hear in order to properly evaluate you.
Yeah, and you can do that for technical and non-technical. I've with data engineers, I have no idea how to be a data engineer, but I will have the director of that team give me a question and tell me they should say one of these 5 words and the context around it and things like that. So then I'm able to do what you had just said. And I think me coming from a non-technical standpoint, being able to do that, and it's the same on the other side. Your technical interviewers need to understand what is a good example, like we're looking for kind of one of these 5 things when we're talking about collaboration or feedback and things like that, and giving that guidance of like what looks good, what looks bad, and then also, and how do you create an environment that you're getting the answer.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right.
Yeah. Well, I am so happy that we've had this conversation, and it was definitely like a lightning bulb, or however you say that.
Light bulb moment.
Yes, light bulb, of just like, oh, that makes so much sense because I'm such in the engineering hiring space that like, yeah, but your perspective of seeing those other ways that interviews are conducted and how people evolve in interviewing differently on different teams is something that I think holding engineering back, and we need to have more positive change there. So thank you so much for coming on and talking about this.
You got it. It was a pleasure.